Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the History Workshop seminar that is going to be, we're going to have a presentation by George for about 20 minutes. Is 20 minutes fine, George? And then we can have a discussion after that.
Anything 20, 25 minutes is good.
Okay, cool. 25, when it's 20, I'll just put my camera on just to give you a heads up. And then after that, we'll take questions. Over to you.
All right. Okay, thank you, Toko. So first of all, let me say, I want to just begin by appreciating everybody who has been, sacrificed their time to turn in to listen to this conversation and my kind of ideas that I'm trying to tease out, ideas, about my book, my forthcoming book, sometimes next year in Ohio University Press. And as you can see, so I start with what tentatively would to me might be the cover page or the front page for the book, and what I'm going to do, I'm just going to move in to start with the structure of the conversation. How I'm going to structure this presentation. So the book is entitled "Violent Encounters: A Gendered History of the First World War in West Africa." I'm going to talk first briefly about the geography and the historical context of the book. And I'm going to kind of, by way of introduction, begin with a story, or what I consider to be a vignette or an epigraph, that begins a book. And I'm going to kind of flesh out, the arguments, flesh out the evidence, and then I'm kind of going to talk about what I believe should be is the contribution of the book to scholarship. And then I'm also going to talk briefly about my sources that I'm using. And of course, I'm going to conclude. So by way of geography and the historical context, you can see on the left-hand side there, you see Cameroon, German Cameroon. Cameroon used to be a German colony from 1884 to 1916, and you can see how that looked like on the map on the left-hand corner. And then you can see where Cameroon is located on the African map, right at the center. Cameroon is often called Africa in miniature. And so this conversation, so the historical processes that I described run through Cameroon as a German colony from 1884 right up to 1914, and then the beginning of the First World War, during which the Allied powers, notably the British, the French, and the Belgians, would mobilize African soldiers from the various Central and West African colonies, and then invade Cameroon. And for 18 months, they would then snatch Cameroon from the Germans and oust the Germans from Cameroon, and then bifurcate the former German colony between Britain and France. So that is for the geographical context. Now, by way of introduction, so this is how I begin the book. So in December 1893, a very, very remarkable event happened in the then German Cameroon, where women began a strike. Women began a strike against the German colonial administration, and that had been unheard of. And so, as I said, German colonialism started in 1884. So it is only about 9 years into the beginning of German colonialism. And there have been a series of injustices going on during which the men themselves, the men are soldiers who, by the way, the Germans had brought from the various West African colonies. The men are unable to challenge the types of injustices that have been going on. But then the women decide that they are going to stand up to the colonial administrators and challenge them and try to make sure that things become redressed. And so these women begin a strike. They begin a strike that is unheard of. And basically, their strike is very much directed against who at the time is the German acting governor, whose name was Henry List. And as they are striking against him, they start to demobilize and they start to move around and they become bellicose. They start to sing songs of bellicosity, war songs, and protesting. And what they are saying, you know, in one of those songs, I'm just kind of, I think I kind of move. Okay, yeah. So what they are saying is they are saying that they don't want any more mistreatment from the white man. They refuse to be subjected to forced labor without good pay. They refuse to be violated by the white man. They refuse because their bodies are for their husbands. They do not want the white man to beat them anymore, and so on and so forth. And this story, this song, I extrapolated this from the archives in Boya in Cameroon, which this was collected and kind of stored there. And that story, as I said, began in 1883. And why this? 1893. Yeah. What happens is that, in spite of that protest, the German colonial administrators they become so upset and they feel unsettled, and then they decide that they would double down and clamp down on the women. So, as a matter of fact, they apprehend some of the women and then they stretch them on the table, and then they began to lash them. They began to lash them with rhinoceros whips, and as if that was not enough, they forced their men to stand in formation and watch as they were flogging the women. And when the men see that, the men are literally pushed to the cliff, and the men say enough is enough. And so the men joined the strike, and eventually they came to the brink of actually collapsing the colonial administration, were it not for the fact that the Germans were able to mobilize and reinforce and bring soldiers from all over the place to be able to quell that rebellion. Now, this incident is kind of almost replicated, about like 20 years back, 20 years thereafter, in 1914, during the time of the First World War, whereby women once again would become subjects of attack. When the war would be going on, what the Germans would do, the German and their soldiers would kind of focus most of their energies against women rather than fighting or countering the Allied soldiers that had come from other colonies. Now, what do these two stories do? These epigraphicum stories that I begin, this book's introduction with. I use these stories in order for me to enter my, the conversation, the book that I want to do. And I use the stories in order to kind of get me started with my arguments in the book. And I'll kind of just enumerate, some of the arguments here. The first argument that I'm making in the book is that the gendered nature of wartime violence must draw from colonial, global, and transnational context. In other words, what I'm arguing is that the sort of violence that permeated the activities of the First World War in Cameroon from 1914 to 1916 is best understood by the nature of colonial violence, which itself was very gendered. It was very gendered in nature. So that's the first argument. The second argument I'm making is that wartime violence in Africa was a continuum and explosive rather than transgressive. Now, I make this argument in order to counter the ways in which scholars that are working on the First World War in Europe have talked about the violence of the war in Europe, particularly the violence of the war in Belgium and northern France when German soldiers invaded, when German soldiers in the course of invading France passed through Belgium. And what historians such as Susan Grezel have said is that the violence of the war in Europe shocked Europe and that it was transgressive. Now, I'm making an argument that that is because they haven't looked enough, they haven't looked beyond Europe. And that if they look beyond Europe, they would understand that the violence of the war in Africa was more what I call cumulative. It was a continuum. It was a continuum of violence. It was explosive rather than transgressive. Now, the third argument that I make is that war experiences in Africa are best understood through the prism of gender. So in other words, I'm arguing that in order for us to have a holistic grasp of, first of all, war mobilization in Africa, the ways in which the war was fought, the ways in which soldiers were mobilized, we need to understand that through the prism of gender. And I'm making, I'm also arguing that Africa presents one of the best laboratories through which we can understand the gender contours or the gender dynamics of how the war was fought. And of course, I'm also kind of using this, to compare with Europe to say that, even if you look at Europe, if you look at the language of, the discourses that were happening, the gender-based discourses that were used in order to mobilize people for war. What happened in Africa was basically the same sort of things that were happening in Europe and Asia. And then, of course, the last argument I make here is that women were not helpless victims, nor bystanders of history. So in other words, I don't just paint women here as victims of the war, but I present women as people who fought back, as people who designed different ways to fight back, to counter the masculine, the type of masculine violence that they were subjected to. And they fought back in several ways. And in the process of fighting, women contributed significantly to the outcomes of the campaigns in West Africa. As a matter of fact, there is a Cameroonian historian, Sylvie Bambuna, who wrote an article, some years back to show that Cameroon was, West Africa and Cameroon in particular was one of the rare places where women actually played combat roles. Women mobilized and fought as soldiers. And as a matter of fact, if you look at Europe, there were parts of Eastern Europe where, a few women played combat roles, but the part of Europe where, the European country where women played combat roles more than any other part in Europe was Russia. And so I'm kind of trying to tack my conversation of women playing combat roles in Cameroon, alongside the sorts of conversations that are going on, about Europe and women's role in the war in Europe. Now, how do I see my studies contribution? The first contribution of this book, is what I call its ability to show gender as a universal concept, that we can use to understand the activities of the First World War, not only in Africa, but by and large in Europe and Asia and all other places. And what I do here is I show that gender-based ideas about masculinity and femininity, the same types of discourses that were happening in Europe as a way to mobilize men to fight, are the same types of discourses that were happening in West Africa. I'm kind of centering this conversation alongside people like Richard Fogarty. Of course, there's Michelle Moy, who is also trying to make a similar kind of conversation about gender. There is Susan Grezel, Tammy Proctor, who recently, 2017, edited the first significant book about gender and the First World War. But unfortunately, all the book chapters are focusing on Europe. without, any significant focus on Africa. So, and I'm saying that we can use gender as a universal concept to understand the war. So that's one of my contributions. And in fact, I show interestingly how, in some parts of Europe, recruiters were using posters of women, brandishing posters of women, beautiful women, and telling men that this is the reason why you must go to war. You must fight for your country. You must go to war and fight because these beautiful women are waiting for you to come back home, when you fight, and things like that. And this similar type of things were also happening in West Africa. Now, my second contribution is I contribute in the area of what has become a new burgeoning historiography of the war, which is historians now starting to recast the war more as a global and transnational event, more than has been thought of for the past 100 years. And this idea, this burgeoning historiography, doesn't go very far back. Actually, we might say that this began around 2004 with Hugh Strachan, a Scottish historian, who began to argue that historians haven't paid enough attention the extent to which this was a global and transnational confrontation. And of course, thereafter, there are other scholars that have taken up on this new. So what's happening here is that there is a historiographical shift in how we understand the war. And that is the contribution that I'm trying to make. And I argue, by the way, that Africa presents one of the best laboratories through which we can understand the global and transnational contours of the war. Why? Because in Cameroon, for example, the war in Cameroon involved about 20 different nationalities. The British soldiers, the French soldiers, the German soldiers, and then the British came with soldiers from their 4 West African colonies. The French came with soldiers from 14 of their West and Central African colonies. The Belgians came with soldiers from Belgian Congo. And there were also 1,000 Indian soldiers that were brought all the way from India to fight in Cameroon. And so I'm using that to argue that West Africa and Cameroon in particular presents the best laboratory or the best setting where we can understand the extent to which this was really a global and a transnational war. And I use this to kind of decolonize the war's historiography, by using gender, as a category of analysis, and to argue that we can recenter the role that gender played in Africa, and we can take that to begin to flesh out, to understand the role of gender in other parts of the world, including Europe. What I'm doing with this kind of argument is that I'm trying to decolonize how we understand the war's historiography. And of course, another contribution is in the area of intersectionality. I use race, I use gender, I use class, I use sexual orientation, I use disability status to show that all these aspects kind of merge together to influence the ways in which the war was conducted. And of course, the last contribution that I make there is I contribute to how we understand modern African refugee and migrant experiences. And I argue that in order for us to understand African migrant and refugee experiences of the 21st century, we need to look at the extent to which the First World War unleashed migrant and refugee issues across the continent in ways that were only comparable to what the slave trade and the slave rates had done, centuries back. And of course, I've already tested this particular part of argument in the book through one of my journals that just recently came out, one of my articles that just recently came out in the Canadian Journal of African Studies. And then by my estimation, I've been talking now for 18 minutes. Right, so I should be, and I'm actually almost getting. Now, what type of sources am I using? Thanks, Tokolo. So these are so I'm using what I generally refer to as the colonial and the imperial archives, so colonial and imperial archives. And these archives are spread, all over in Africa and in Europe for obvious reasons. The archives in the UK, the archives in France, particularly in Aix-en-Provence, in a small township in southern France. I'm using the archives in Nigeria. I'm using the archives in Cameroon. I'm using the archives in Ghana. Ghana, I forgot to include here because I just recently visited that archives, and I'm also using the archives in Bayreuth in Germany. But besides this, litany of archives that I'm using, I wanted to talk specifically about, the source base, the source types. I'm relying a lot on women's war songs. And I consider women's war songs as a form of oral tradition. A form of oral tradition, particularly when it comes to trying to understand the history of the First World War. And women's war songs convey women's experiences, both women and men's experiences of the war, in ways that not a single conventional archival source material is able to do, or the military reports. I'm also using what I refer to as the contemporaneous newspapers, which means newspapers that were generated during the time of the war. I'm using diaries and memoirs. I'm using war registers and military manuals and handbooks. And of course, I'm using regimental and official histories. Now, by way of, so this is a provisional conclusion for the book. Of course, the book's general conclusion is going to be something anywhere like about 5 to 10 pages, but I'm kind of already trying to pieces together a few lines in terms of how I want to conclude the book, and this is just very brief. So this is what I say. For over 100 years, a gendered history of the war that captures the varied and diverse experiences of men and women, and especially the crucial ways in which women experience the war in all parts of the globe, and made sacrifices and contributions to what came to be known as the First Global War, is long overdue. For over 4 years, humanity slaughtered one another in a war that they claimed was a man's war. Yet the entire calculus of the war, in terms of how it was planned, sustained, and executed, depended equally on women's sacrifices and experiences. The First World War, be it in Europe, in Asia, or in North America, was just as much a woman's war. It was a gendered war. In recent times, global gender politics has focused increasingly on gender equality. Historians can contribute meaningfully to steps towards the realization of global gender equality by recasting the equally consequential roles that women and men played in landmark events such as the First World War, which have been instrumental in the development of a modern globalized world as we know it today. My book contributes to this goal by departing from the over 100 years of androcentric scholarship of the war to offer a gendered reading of the war in West Africa. And with that, I come to the end of my conversation, and then I will say thank you, which is Ayongna in a Com language, and then I will say Siyabonga in Zulu. I wouldn't want to say the rest of the ones because I don't trust my pronunciation there. But that is it. And thank you for listening to these ideas about my book that I've tried to tease them out, and I'm looking forward to an engaging conversation that would go a long way to enhance the quality of my arguments. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, George, for a fascinating presentation, and all the best with the book. At this point, I'm going to ask that anyone who has a question or a comment can just raise their hand, and then George can answer. or otherwise you can drop a comment or a question in the chat box, and I can read it for George to answer. I don't see any hands, but just for me, out of curiosity, George, I thought I found interesting the ways in which you were saying, you know, you said something about empowering gender as a universal category. If you could like maybe expand a little bit on that while we're waiting for other people to maybe gather their thoughts. And yeah.
Right. So thanks, Willie. So let me say this. So here's my position. Now, using gender, the ways in which gender as a category of analysis, historical category of analysis, which, by the way, I should acknowledge the work of Joan Scott, her seminal work that was a seminar article that was published in the American Historical Review in 1986, which is something that pushed historians, to start to pay a lot more attention to the use of gender as a category of historical analysis, in which you prescribe that, gender. So we use gender to understand the varied and the diverse experiences of men and women, and that gender is both about the ways in which men and women, were historical actors, were historical protagonists, and that what gender does is that it allows us to understand, certain aspects of it, like masculinity and femininity, as experiences that define one and
I think you are muted, George.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Sorry. I mean this. Yeah, technology is funny. The thing just muted me on its own. So yeah. Thanks for reminding me. So what I was saying is that when I look at that definition of gender as a category of historical analysis, then I am struck. I am struck by the ways in which, to me, I think that the societies that were involved in the war, which was defined as a man's war, I think that the world has been very much unappreciative, very much unjust to the role that women played in the war. And I'll give you an example. When the war was being fought, and Europe, seeing the role that women played in the war, they decide to bifurcate it into two, what they call the home front and what they call the battlefront. Now, this retrospective terminology distinguishing between the home front and the battlefront was in order to be able to carve out and show the outstanding role that women played. And because of that, lawmakers and politicians in Europe rushed to make laws. They rushed to make laws, gender-based laws that kind of redefine women's role in the society, laws that allow women to do certain things that they had not been able to do before the First World War. And guess what? As soon as the war ended, societies move back, and then they roll back, they backpedal on many of the policies that had been made, to accommodate women. They backpedal on those policies. Men rush back to retake some of the jobs that had been performed by women during the war. So what has happened is that effectively women were used during the war, and immediately after the war, the world as a man's society kind of recoiled. It kind of recoiled and then moved back to the status quo, the pre-war status quo. And it has taken about 100 years for scholars to, in fact, it took the centenary of the war in 2014 for scholars to kind of start to rethink back the role of women. So my ability to use gender as a category of analysis to understand the war, not just in a specific geographic region, not just in Africa, but also in Europe, also in Asia, and also in North America, I think that empowers gender as a category of historical analysis in relation to the history of the First World War in ways that no other event or no other study has been able to do. So that, to me, I think is the power that gender entails when it comes to the history of the war.
Right. Thank you for that, George. Anyone who wants to pose a question or a comment can also do it. Use the chat facility. I'm only seeing one hand. Clive, please go ahead.
Right. Thanks. Thank you. George, it sounds absolutely fascinating and really very impressive and important research you're doing. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the final product. Something I was thinking about as you were talking is, do you in some way also address the relationships, the gender relationships within Cameroonian indigenous society as well, or local society as well? I mean, and how does that impact on the story you're telling? I mean, do for example, do women see this as an opportunity to assert their own rights and powers within local society as well? Do men also get in some ways threatened by the assertiveness of women during these times?
Right, Clive. Thank you for your generous comment and of course for your question. So this is how I answer that kind of a question. So this is what happened in Cameroon. Now, in terms of women reasserting their place, or in terms of women using the war as an opportunity to reassert their place in the society, how do I see that? I think to a certain extent, I would argue that yes, women actually use the war as an occasion to reassert their place in the society. You would remember I mentioned during the presentation an article that was written I think 2 decades now or something by a female historian who is based in Cameroon, Sylvie, she's French, Sylvie Bambouna. And in that article, she shows that the women who played combat roles, the women who disguised themselves, who dressed themselves up in military attire and used clubs, used spears, used den guns, and so on. And as a matter of fact, some of them were even integrated into the German military battalion that fought in some part of South Cameroon in 1914. Now, she has suggested, she has made a kind of an underdeveloped argument, trying to look at the lives of these women in their post-war society, the lives that they live, and the challenges that they brought to the political structures of the society and even the military structures of the society after the war. And she tries to argue, she tries to say, this is not really like an argument, but to suggest that after the war, the women used their experiences, the particular women who played combat roles used their experiences to begin to challenge some of the political structures in Southern Cameroon, and also to begin to insist that the local military organizations should include a women's battalion. So you could look at this as a kind of a new awakening that is being brought by the war, and women are beginning to challenge some of the social structures, some of the political structures, the military structures, on the basis of the significant role that they had played in the war. And by the way, German missionaries, particularly women missionaries who were in Cameroon at the time, and also including male missionaries, wrote biographical accounts where they explain that the role that local Cameroonian women played in aiding their men and the society during the war was far more than the role that German women who were present in Cameroon at the same time played in terms of how they were able to help their men. And yes, of course, so one would argue that there is some sort of post evidence, though underdeveloped, that the war transformed, gender roles in post-war Cameroon. But I think more substantively, I have tried to make this argument elsewhere to show that the war transformed gender identities in what I might refer to as a sequel to my study, which I published 2 years ago in the Journal of Social History, an article that is entitled "Amputated Men: Masculinity, Colonial Bureaucracy, and Post-World War Disability in Post-War Nigeria." And there I'm showing that because of when men became disabled in the war and then they returned home, men had to rely, most of the men who were disabled had to rely on their women to take care of them. Their women became caregivers. And there was a transformation of gender identities. Men's identities were transformed. And women, now, men had been breadwinners. Men had been breadwinners before the war. But the men who became disabled, there was a kind of a swap of domestic family roles, whereby women now were becoming breadwinners to their own men, taking care of the men and taking care of the economy of households. So, and because of this, women in Nigeria, as in Ghana as well, are beginning to make certain requests, certain demands that had been inconceivable before the outbreak of the war. And so the argument is that it is because of the role that women played in the war, as well as the diminished, what was that word again? The diminishment, the diminishment of men's physical capabilities, that women are then using that to reassert the role that women should play in the society. I hope
Thanks, George. That's very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, no one else. I don't see any other hand. But while we're waiting for other people to, sort of gather their thoughts, I would be interested, George. What you think, like, if you could say a little bit about the next steps that you think might be interesting for you while you undertake writing the book. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, thanks. So here's the next step. So I'm already working on my second book simultaneously. So as I mentioned, moments ago about an article that I did that was like a sequel to this particular argument, the article on amputated men. That article would actually eventually form the first chapter of my second book. So I'm already looking beyond this book project. And this is what my second book does. And I think in explaining this, I think this would actually put things in context. My second book is entitled Amputated Men. World War I disability, masculinity, and the struggles of the First World War disabled soldiers in British and French West Africa. And so this book looks at the legacies of the war in terms of the reshaping of gender identities. And this book is inspired by one of the best books, a fantastic book that was written, I think it's in 2012 or 2012 or 2010, by the British female historian Deborah Cohen. And the title of the book is The War Come Home. And in that book, she compares the challenges that the war disabled face in Britain vis-a-vis the challenges that the war disabled face in Germany, and the ways in which the British government treated their war disabled as opposed to how the German government treated their war disabled. Now, before her book, historians had assumed that the reason why veterans, why World War I veterans, and particularly the disabled, why they caused social havoc and political instability in Germany was because Germany was considered to have lost the war. And that the reason why the war disabled and the veterans in Britain stayed calm, docile, and peaceful was because Britain was considered to have won the war. But her book kind of unveils something that historians had not seen. And that is what I'm also trying to do in British and French West Africa. In her book, she argues that the fundamental reason why the war disabled and veterans stayed docile and calm in England, in spite of the fact that the British government paid lesser attention to the war disabled as opposed to what the German government did. She argues that it was because of the nature of the British society and the relationship between the war veterans and the civil society, those who didn't go to war. Now, I'm looking at British West Africa vis-a-vis French West Africa, and I realized, preliminary research, people like Joe Lon, people like Richard Fogarty, people like Meron Echimbeng, who just unfortunately passed away last week. These are people who have tried to articulate gender identities in French West Africa, war gender identities. And they are already beginning to suggest, from their scholarship, to suggest that the war veterans in French West Africa were more were activists. They were more active and kind of more disgruntled with the French colonial state, and so they brought a little bit of havoc as compared to the war veterans in French West Africa. So what my second book does is that why was it like that? Just as in the British metropolis, the British in West Africa, in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Sierra Leone, in the Gambia, the British colonial administrators paid far less attention to the war disabled as opposed to what the French colonial administrators did in French West Africa. And yet, British, the soldiers, ex-soldiers in British West Africa remained calm and docile, and there was some sort of political stability. So what I'm doing in this second book is I'm investigating what was the relationship between the ex-soldiers in the French West African colonies, what was the relationship between them and the local communities, the civil society, as opposed to what was the relationship between the ex-soldiers in British West Africa and the civil society. And is it possible for us to explain the behavior of these ex-soldiers in these two different colonies? Can we explain this behavior on the basis of the social dynamics and interactions that were happening between them and the local communities, rather than look at the relationship between them and the colonial states? So that is what my second book does.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that. I think Njogu has a question, and there's one question from Kasonde on the chat. I'm just gonna read it out. Just a question on methods. Since I'm at the research phase of my study, you talk about the challenge of using archives in West Africa, Ghana a little better, such as limits of photography, etc. How did you overcome these challenges just by taking copious notes? Are newspapers digitalized? Also, what are the challenges of using sources, both primary and secondary, in German? So maybe we get Njung to ask his question, and then you can answer both, and then perhaps in that also include your closing remarks.
Okay, thanks.
Right.
Yeah, thanks to Caleb. It's just a quick comment. First of all, George, I mean, it sounds, yeah, I'm really looking forward to your book. I mean, you've done an enormous amount of work, and it really makes for really interesting reading. So well done so far, and good luck to the next phases of the study. It was just a quick question about how the war currently is remembered in Cameroon, because you make an interesting point about how, you know, in the scholarship, the war has been understood as a man's war. And I'm just wondering to what extent that kind of idea resonates in Cameroon currently, or not, in which case it'd be very interesting for your book, what kind of public impact your book makes in unearthing some of the stories that you are about kind of the role that's, or the agency of women in the war. So just a question on how the war is remembered through the gendered perspective that you're raising here in Cameroon today. Thanks.
Right. Thanks so much. So let me start with Kasonde. So Kasonde, this is let me put it in, you know, very plain, simple way. This is how I overcame the challenges at the archives in West Africa. I overcame the challenges by using money. So that's to say that when you have enough money, when you can establish a relationship, or if you can establish a relation of power, right? If you can position yourself as, you know, as somebody who is generous enough, you know, ready to pay whatever number of archival pages that you need, and nice enough that you can take the archival staff to during lunch. You can come in one of the days and you say, okay, today lunch is on me, and things like that, and then you get an easier way around. So in other words, what I'm saying is that when I last did significant research in Nigeria, you know, some years back, and I think also in Cameroon, there used to be a limit to how many photos or images that you can digitize a day. But I think that limit is no longer there. But the biggest challenge that I was trying to put there is financial. That it is very expensive. It is very expensive to use the archives in Ghana or Nigeria or Cameroon, you know, generally speaking, all of West Africa, because you pay before you take digital images of all those archival materials. Whereas in the UK, for example, you don't pay anything. In France, you don't pay anything. In the UK, you want to take 1 million photos, that's fine. If you have your digital device, you can take unlimited. So that's what happens in the UK. That's what happens in France. Even in terms of how much money you pay to register to use the archives, it's almost, I think in the UK, I think it's you don't pay anything for the first time or something like that. Or even if you pay, I think it's something like £5. But the archives in West Africa, you have to pay money to register, which is significant, and you have to pay money to be able to take photos of anything there in the archive. So that's the biggest challenge that I was talking about. So if you have the financial means, you would be able to overcome some of those challenges. And I was regretting there that it's ironical. It's ironical because in the West, you know, in the global North, both students and faculty and researchers, they have the means, they have the money that they can pay because most of them go, with huge research grants. They go to the archives with grants and all of that. So they have the money if they were asked to pay. They would be able to pay. Whereas in Africa, people don't have the money when they go to the archives. And yet they are asked to pay. They are asked to pay more money than in the West. And paradoxically, they don't have the money. So that's like, of course, there are many other different types of challenges. Even the question of accessibility, for example, like whether in Nigeria or in Cameroon, sometimes you ask for files and then you have to wait for a long, because much of the stuff is manual. You ask for files and then you wait for a while. Sometimes the files come, they give you files, you finish some, and then you might have to wait 30 minutes or an hour before the next file. As compared to, say, UK, for example. UK, you are requesting all these files from your computer, right? You sit there at the archives, you're requesting the files, and the files are coming faster than you can read them. Whereas in West Africa, the files are coming much slower than you are able to read them. So those are the kind of problems. Now, Jogo, so to your question as to how the war currently is remembered in Cameroon. So here's my answer to it. Almost zero remembrance. And this is a problem. This is a big problem. Now, of course, you might explain that, Cameroon's checkered history, might account for this. Why? Because at the time of the war, Cameroon was a German colony. And so after the war, Cameroon was seized from Germany, bifurcated between Britain and France. Cameroon has had a very checkered and zigzag history since then. And so Cameroon is no longer under German government. If Cameroon had survived up to independence as a German colony, it might have been different. But then, if you look at Nigeria and Ghana, for example, which were British colonies, it is not as if the war is remembered there that much, say, compared to Europe. But if you compare those British colonies, ex-colonies with Cameroon, then they are much more ahead in terms of how they remember the war. So they have graves, for fallen soldiers and so on and so forth. And so what is happening in Cameroon is that all these, remarkable, unprecedented role that women play, it's almost completely forgotten since the war isn't remembered. Even soldiers who die, nobody even remembers. Now, let me give you an example how bad it is. On 6 September 1914, in a border town, in a village called Sanankang, bordering Cameroon and Nigeria, when the British Nigerian soldiers invaded Cameroon, over 100 soldiers died there, both from Cameroon soldiers and Nigerian soldiers, and were buried there, almost in a mass grave. 3 British officers were also buried there. Their graves were marked. And guess what? Decades after, if you go there, the entire place is just a bush. You can't even see the graves anymore. So now that is to show to you. And that is considered as the most disastrous encounter and the place in which the vast majority of soldiers who died were buried on one spot. We don't even have a memorial there. So recently, I was nominated as an advisory board member of Commonwealth War Memorials. And my role is to suggest, my role alongside other board members, independent board members, by the way, is to suggest to Commonwealth War Memorials areas where they should be going, particularly in Cameroon and all of West Africa, areas where they should be going in order to commemorate graves of fallen soldiers. And also possibly suggest names of the soldiers, the places where they died and when they died. And in my conversation with the Commonwealth War Graves, part of the problem they are facing is that African government themselves are not even commemorating or remembering these landmark historical events that happened, in their own countries. And so one of the ways we're thinking that by kind of resuscitating these settings and these graves and commemorating them, African governments, including particularly Cameroon, would then become more aware of the role that local Cameroonians played in such a landmark event, and therefore would then be able to remember and recognize the war in ways that it has not been able to do. And I think within that framework, it is going to be within that framework that women's important role is also going to come into limelight. So that is where things stand as of now. So thank you for your question. And concluding remarks. Well, I don't really have any concluding remarks other than say thank you to everyone. Thank you for your attention, for listening, and for your questions and engagements, which I believe would help me in enhancing my the direction of the book, my arguments. Even though of course the book is almost halfway done. The book is six chapters plus the general introduction, which is the one that I sent out, which is itself almost like a chapter, and then the conclusion. And I've already completed almost 4 chapters of the book, and it's just left 2 chapters. So all I can say it's thank you for your time, and thank you for an engaging conversation. That's all I can say.
All right. Thank you very much, George. And for those that are interested, I just dropped the link of your publication, Amputated Men, Colonial Bureaucracy and Masculinity in the Post-World War I in Colonial Nigeria, if anyone wants to read that. And once again, thank you so much to everyone's contribution. Thank you to George. And please look out for the next History Workshop seminar. Yeah, have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Bye.